Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Sitting alone on the bench at the park, I looked down at my phone to confirm the time. 1:58 a.m. 2 minutes until he arrived. I looked around anxiously, gripping my backpack tied to my chest for a moment, before recoiling at the horrific smell emanating from it. 1:59 a.m. I took a deep breath and let out a slow exhale before unzipping my bag. The stench hit me at full force and wafted through the air. I looked down again at my phone and saw the time had hit 2 a.m. And like clockwork, I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. A pained groan and a cough accompanied the rustling. Stone-faced, I turned around to the sound of the noise and saw the figure responsible. He was taller than the last time that I had seen him. He was maybe around 6'6" now, when previously he had been under 6 feet. He was still rail thin, however. Really, nothing more than a skeleton with a thin layer of gray skin that had brown tufts of hair in random patches across his body. He shambled toward me, slowly moving one knock-knee-legged in front of the other. Every time we'd meet, I'd try and keep focus on his body, and still, without fail, my eyes would wander towards his abomination of a face. His bald head appeared human, but if his eyes weren't covered by a dirty blindfold, I'm sure I'd be looking into an empty, endless black void. But what always disturbed me the most was his wide mouth that hung open, enough for me to see jumbled rows of canine teeth and dog-like molars. A flat tongue flopped out, and I could hear him panting as he came towards me. I stood to face him and put my hand out in front of a beak-like nose for him to sniff me. His wrinkled lips curled into a smile, and he took a step back. He raised up an arm and revealed a poorly formed leg was growing out of the bicep. He pointed the leg at my bag, and in a deep, buzzy voice asked,
"Did you bring it?"
Without a word, I reached behind me to grab my backpack and threw it in front of him, and as soon as it hit the ground, he got onto all fours and began tearing into the bags of rotten meat that spilled out. I nearly gagged as I watched him choke down the assortment of roadkill and rotten fish that I had bought. And once done with his meal, he snapped his head towards me and hung his mouth open again, viscous saliva dripping to the ground in anticipation. I grabbed a second bag from the side of the bench and reached inside to pull out a small container. He stomped the ground with anticipation, and as I revealed, the heart of a dog that I had obtained from a nearby pet cemetery. And when I presented it to him, he quickly snatched it out of my hand and forced it down his throat, swallowing the whole thing. He shuddered for a moment and then vomited a black liquid. He then stood back up to his feet and gargled out,
"Thank you very much. Your family is safe for the next 30 days. If you disappoint, I will consume you all while you sleep, and there will be no forgiveness."
I simply nodded in response, opting to go back down on all fours. He shambled back off into the bushes. I waited a moment to ensure he wouldn't return. I flopped back onto the bench and grabbed for my backpack. Unzipping the first pocket revealed the gun that I had bought a year ago. I stared down at it, contemplating why I couldn't bring myself to use it. It's a ritual I practiced after every time I saw him. My mind would flash back to the time that we'd been caught. A man walking by himself saw the creature, pulled out his pistol and unloaded everything he had into the dogman. I watched in horror as the same man laid on the ground with his jaw missing only moments later. The dogman, no worse for wear, crunching away at the new chew toy, and of all things, reciting a damn poem.
Joyful, 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 as only dogs know how to be happy, with only the autonomy of their shameless spirit.
He repeated over and over while crunching through the flesh and bone of the man's jaw. Part of me knows that I couldn't kill him, but the rest thinks that I'm a coward for not trying anyway. Self-defense without the intent of ever defending yourself or your family. How mad is that? My eyes drifted from the weapon to the bile left by the dogman. I could see maggots crawling away from the mess, or at least, maggots are what I describe them as. They had to be 3 or 4 times the size of your average maggot at birth, and had little limbs that they used to move around. I sighed, got up, and made sure to kill every single one I could find. This curse wouldn't spread if I could help it. Eventually, I could feel myself starting to shut down. I got my stuff, hopped in my car, and drove home, hoping that I could enjoy the next 29 days before I'd have to meet the devil himself again.
When I was serving in Afghanistan, I witnessed some strange stuff. First of all, I did not see any creature but encountered some weird stuff. One of the roles I served was essentially a hearts and minds role, in that we made an effort to get to know the locals and get them to look at us in a better light. Just simple things like giving out food, building things, bringing the kids footballs, etc. One family we constantly met were a family of goat farmers. Over the weeks we got pretty friendly and would share stories through our translator. One day I was talking to him about his goats and how hard life is out here. He said it was fine, but the only thing that bothered him was Bamut. I thought initially it was the local Taliban strongman or something, but he said no, it was an animal. Now, this next bit is said through a translator, so bear that in mind. He said, it's the running wolf. Myself and the translator didn't really know what he meant, but he just said again, a wolf that runs like a man. He then asked us to follow him. Initially I refused, but eventually relented, as I felt he would not lead us to danger, and it may offend him more not to. He led us to a cave about 30 minutes away. In this cave we found what looked like crude drawings on the wall. Nothing you could make out well, but definitely something had drawn by scraping rock. But more disturbing was several gouged lines in the rocks, about 1/3 of an inch deep and about 1 foot long. We had a joke about it, but I tried cutting a similar mark into the wall with my knife, but couldn't do it. Bear in mind, I've been powerlifting since 16, so I'm pretty strong, but couldn't come close. The biggest red flag, however, was the remains of what I think was a goat carcass. Now, this cave was about 300 yards up, about a 60% incline. I don't know how a fox, which is the only predator I saw out there, could kill a goat and drag it from the closest farm, 1.5 kilometers away, up that slope into the mountains. It freaked me out, to be honest. For the remaining 3 months of that tour, I heard noises a few times a week, sounding like a woman wailing. Might be something, or might just be a grown man being scared by a shepherd's story. I'm not weighing in on if they are real or not, but I did find this compelling. I know this is not strictly Dogman, so maybe this is the wrong place for it, but maybe someone might find it interesting.
The spooky house at the end of the street is such a common trope, but have you ever wondered how it became that way? Most people that I've met, if you ever mention such a house, will agree that they had one in their neighborhood growing up, Often, the house will just be deserted and the overgrown lawn the result of neglect and nature reclaiming the space. Sometimes, the neighborhood weirdo will live there. Maybe it's a spooky old cat lady or a meth-crazed loony. And when I was a child, we had a dogman. I grew up in a fairly normal suburb, maybe a little down on the socioeconomic ladder, but there was hardly any crime and all of the neighborhood and their kids were nice. I went to school with most of the latter, and we spent lazy weekends riding our bikes around the streets together. A few blocks from my house were the train tracks and a long rutted road that ran alongside them down to a huge area of bushland. It's all since been bulldozed and developed into a neat little housing estate. But 30 years ago, that's where Dogman lived. Our parents warned us against going anywhere near the bushland due to the junkies that would camp out and party down there from time to time. They never caused much havoc, but would leave bottles and condoms and needles laying around, which our parents obviously wanted us to avoid. It wasn't until my brother and I, and some of the other neighborhood kids, grew old and bold enough to ride our bikes down that old road. Despite promising our parents that we'd never go that far, that we even found the place. His house wasn't tall and looming and gothic, or anything even remotely as impressive. A single-story bungalow that looked from the street like it couldn't have contained more than 3 or 4 rooms total. The most intimidating feature was an 8-foot steel-barred fence that ran the entire perimeter. It looked like something out of a jail or a military base. Through the fence we could see an overgrown yard strewn with what looked like parts of car engines and other chunks of twisted rusting metal. Oh, and 3 absolutely enormous dogs. As an adult, when I think about that time and the awful thing that nearly happened, I know deep down that they were probably just Rottweilers, and that my childhood imagination had conflated them into pony-sized red-eyed slavering monsters. But back then, my companions and I were terrified of them. On the occasions that we thought that we could get away with it, we'd ride down to the bush past Dogman's house and dare each other to scale the fence, or maybe throw something over to taunt the dogs. None of us were ever brave enough to actually do either, and we'd console ourselves with fanciful what-ifs about the children that must have been devoured by the beast and the unmarked graves hidden beneath the car engines. And as for Dogman himself, I was the only one amongst my little coterie of BMX bandits that had ever laid eyes on him, and only because one day I'd finally succumbed to a dare. He was tall, lean, and lanky, with long straggly gray hair and deep-set eyes. He had all these strange symbols tattooed up his arms, and what little I could see of his chest under his stained wife beater. In my memory, he looked like a wolf walking as a man. I'd crept up to the fence on the bushland side of his property and peered through to see if I could see any children's bones in the yard, as I'd been dared. I'd only been spying for a minute or two when he stepped out on the porch and started sniffing the air. And after only a couple of seconds, his head whipped around and he glared straight at me. Even though I was hiding in the overgrown grass, I bolted out there like the hounds of hell were after me, and in my fevered imagination, 3 of them were. It was one rainy Saturday afternoon that we met Dogman and his monstrous pets face to face. I was riding lazily up and down the street with my brother Mikey and the kid next door, Doug. Being kids, we had no compunctions about riding even in the worst weather, and it was summer, so the rain was refreshing. It was Doug that suggested a race to the bushes, and boredom prompted the three of us to start pedaling like mad down to the old rutted road. We flew by Dogman's house without slowing down, too intent on the race and the momentary glory that would come from the win. Mikey was the smallest of us, but he was also the fastest, so he skidded to a stop at the end of the road moments before Doug and I arrived. We held up his hands in a victor's pose before loudly proclaiming that he needed to take a whiz. I did too, and Doug shrugged his agreement, so we wandered off a little way into the bushes to find our own trees to take a leak on. The sky had turned darker, and thunder was rumbling around the horizon, so we knew we'd have to head home when we were done. I was just zipping up when I heard Mikey scream. I turned and hopped and skipped through the dense bushes to where I'd last seen him, thinking maybe he'd found a snake. And when I got there, I was alerted to heavy rustling nearby, as though someone was struggling. I started to panic, thinking he'd been eaten, and I dashed after him. I broke through an open area filled with spinifex grass and spotted a tall man with long hair dragging Mikey into a thicket about 10 meters away. Mikey saw me at the same time and started to scream again, but the man hit him in the head, and Mikey fell imp. I had no idea where Doug was, but all I could think of was saving my little brother. I grabbed the biggest stick that I could find, and I plunged after him. It couldn't have been longer than literally a minute before I nearly fell into the junkies' camp. They'd set up an old creek bed, and the area was strewn with sleeping bags, milk crates, old mattresses, bottles, and other detritus. And I saw Mikey and Doug laying against a log, unmoving, both with blood in their hair and on their faces. My heart leapt into my throat. Now I was here. What was I going to do? I should have gone for help. What if there were more junkies? I'd barely picked myself up when a filthy hand grabbed my collar. I tried to spin around, swinging my stick wildly, but a short, crazed-eyed man stepped out from behind a tree and grabbed my wrist. A long-haired man who had snagged my collar wrenched me to the ground and started pulling at my pants, while the short one pinned my arms to the ground above my head. It started to rain heavily. I don't clearly remember what happened next. It was so sudden and chaotic, but I'll describe it how I saw it. A bone-shaking roar exploded from nearby, and for a second, I wildly thought it was thunder and hoped for a lightning bolt to smash into the campsite. Instead, 3 enormous black dogs barreled into the clearing like the wrath of the devil and slammed into the junky creeps that had pinned me with impacts that I could feel through the ground. I'll never forget the sounds that followed. I could never have conceived that a grown man could scream like that. I felt splatters of hot blood and saliva fleck my face and arms amid the freezing raindrops as I crawled across to Mikey and Doug. Doug was already rousing due to the fevered howling and growling, but Mikey wouldn't open his eyes. We grabbed him by the arms and started dragging him towards the road. Peripherally, I was aware of the flailing and scrambling and the pouncing that was happening near the bank, but I couldn't bring myself to look. All I could think was I'd have nightmares for the rest of my life. We made it through the patch, back past our pea trees, and we were just about at our bikes when we skidded to a stop. Dogman was standing there in the torrential downpour in a battered old Cobra and ankle-length duster. And until my dying day, I will swear that his eyes were glowing in the stormlight. Behind me, I heard rustling and heavy panting, and from the corner of my eye, I could see the 3 hellhounds stepping from the bushes and starting to circle us. Doug dropped Mikey's other arm and ran, I shouted at him, but he vanished into the rain and scrub. I started to cry. Mom and Dad would be so angry with me. Then Dogman uttered the only word that I'd ever hear him speak. Heel. The 3 colossal dogs calmly trotted towards him. Dogman turned his back and then walked away, the dogs in tow. I sat shivering and sobbing in the storm next to my unconscious little brother for what felt like hours. And after a while, Mikey woke up and asked me what was wrong. The rain had washed most of the blood off of his face, but there was a huge lump over his right eye. I hugged him and never wanted to let go, but he shook me off and got on his bike. We're gonna be in so much trouble, he said as he started to ride towards home. And we were, holy cow, were we ever. I never ventured back down the road again, despite the most haunting of dares. Part of me wanted to thank Dogman, and the rest of me was too terrified to take my chances.
This happened a couple of years ago. At the time I was 17 and me and 3 of my friends had been up to a cabin in North Carolina in the mountains. We were celebrating the end of junior year of high school. It was just the 4 of us. First night we got there, we heard some noises from outside the cabin at about 1:30 in the morning. I did not want to look outside to see what it was. My friend did and said they couldn't see anything. So I looked out, and I couldn't see anything either. Next morning, we went outside and saw some footprints. Footprints like I've never seen before, and I hope to never see again. Fast forward to the night, we decide to go outside and have a campfire. We're 17, 18-year-old kids, joking around, laughing, having fun, enjoying the summer, when we hear a growl from the woods. And the shrubbery and smaller plants around us start moving, like they're in the wind, even though there's no wind. I look behind me and I see 2 amber eyes, staring. I turn to my friend to ask if he's seen it too. He looks at me pale in the face and asks me, what the hell is that thing? I don't know what it is. All I know is it's massive, and I don't want to find out, so we run inside the cabin and tell the other people that were there what we saw. And of course they don't believe us, so they look outside, and it's standing there, about 9.5 feet tall. Greyish black fur, very muscular with these massive claws and huge fangs. So they ran inside and shut the door, and we closed the blinds and tried to forget about the thing. Later that night, I went up to bed and looked outside my window. And it was out there, staring directly at me. Needless to say, I didn't get any sleep that night. The next day, we packed up and left, not wanting to spend another night in those woods. This is the first time I've told anybody about this, because I didn't think anybody would believe me. To this day, the image of that creature staring into my eyes from my bedroom window still haunts me.
In 2018, I spent Christmas at a friend's family home in South Australia in a middle-of-nowhere kind of place. And while we were there was one night that we were at a bar having dinner and just a few drinks. Afterwards, we were walking and we got to the road down by an old school. As we got closer, we could hear this strange noise. And we got to the corner, and there was a gathering of chickens on the side of the road. As we got closer, my friend mentioned something in the middle of this gathering. A black dog, or so we assumed. And as he got closer, I chose to stand back as I have a fear of dogs. But then, the dog got up on all 4s and the chickens ran. As the chickens ran, this thing stood up on 2 legs. I still see it as a dog's face, not a look-alike dog, but a full-on dog's face whose back was up and bent over. Its front arms just laid by its side and the legs were very strong, kinda like a horse. This thing looked at us and stepped back, then ran down the road as we watched it disappear into the night. We got back to the house and woke up everyone and then told them all about what we saw, and they all wanted to get into the car and see if we could find it. After talking about it, we decided not to go out during the night and decided to go back in the morning. And all we found was a few chicken feathers and some broken grass where they were all gathering, but no signs of the Australian dogman. Everyone I've talked to goes to Yeti because of their close ties to Australia, but that does not explain a dog transformation into a man-sized humanoid. We heard a lot about UFOs active in the area and a few haunted locations, but most of the locals have never heard of anything like that. One farmer was more worried about the chickens that we saw as they had to come from somewhere. My friend has also had a shadow man follow him home in the same area after this incident, but I wasn't there for that, so I only know what he told me, and also from the stuff that he would tell me from at that time. But that's a story for another time. Unfortunately, that's all there is. It's rather unfair to see something so unnatural that even believers find it hard to believe. I can only tell them what I saw, and in the time that I had with it, I didn't even know what I saw. The chase. My heart felt like it was about to burst. I couldn't stop running. If I stop, I'll die. It's gaining on me. I left my boyfriend behind as food for the beast. The wolf? Dogman. Was he a werewolf? Whatever it was, I didn't have a choice. My boyfriend's skin had already been torn off, soon followed by an arm and a leg, and he screamed loudly and pleaded with me to run. The sight of the blood, all that blood. I wish I hesitated or tried to help, but as soon as the words were out of his mouth, I turned and ran as fast as I could. The last sight I saw was his head being ripped off and the burst of blood into the air. That blood. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran away as fast as I could. The wolfman. Well, he didn't seem so bad when we first met him. We asked for help. Did he have any spare matches or anything? He was so friendly, so kind, and invited us to stay near his cabin. We're new to hiking and camping, and we're happy for the help. My mom has always hated camping and always tried to keep me away from the woods. But I've always been drawn to them. She never said why. But she was right. I never should have come here. I could hear the howling behind me. How could such a mild-mannered man turn into a beast? Everyone heard of werewolf legends. His eyes changed as he turned into a beast. The formerly mild-mannered former librarian had black fur burst from his body. His muscles swelled, and those jaws where my boyfriend was lost. I'd look back into the darkness and see those glowing yellow eyes, always getting harder. My lungs also felt like they were going to burst. I leaned with my back against a tree, hunched over and panting. I couldn't let him take me. I couldn't let him change me into something that I am not. The wolf was gaining ground. I fell. I sobbed and tried my best to crawl away, and I could hear it behind me. The breath of the beast, as the moonlight allowed it to cast a shadow down over me. My stomach twisted. My chest was tight. I could hear it behind me. I simply could not go on anymore. Every muscle burned, every limb ached, and I was going to have a heart attack. I looked up at the sky and realized the change in me. You can never deny who or what you are, and I threw my glasses when the sky changed and the moon appeared.
Daughter.
Could I understand him? You could never deny who you are. You could never deny what you are. My body was beginning to morph. The muscles bulged as fur roughly pushed from my skin. My clothing ripped, and I could not resist howling at the moon. And behind me, the wolfman. My father brought the corpse of my boyfriend over, and I sunk my teeth into him, ripping his mangled body even more apart. I was home. I was finally home. And here are the top comments for my last video. And here's the riddle for this video. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. But I would also like to thank my amazing patrons, my top tippers, and my dearest channel members. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it with all of my heart. If you want to support the channel further, you could also choose to become a patron, a tipper, or a channel member. But remember, it's appreciated, but never a requirement. I would also like to announce that we have merch now. The link is in the description of the video, along with all my other social media links, like my Discord server, Twitter, Instagram, and others. You can connect with me and send your stories there. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and comments are highly appreciated. And remember, your fear feeds me.